Okay, we are going to start, even if, yeah, we are maybe not so many as other times. What's happening with the Greening the City students and the Mas students? Come on. Just what in the WhatsApp group, maybe you can tell them to come. There's nice beers here, nice presentation. Anyway, okay, I'm just going to introduce the speaker. For those of you that you know, well, I think that more or less everybody knows me here, but I'm Francesc Baró. I'm assistant professor at the geography department of the VUV. And I will have the pleasure to introduce the invited speaker today. She's Margerita Triguero Mas, there. She's an environmental scientist working at the intersection of public health, urban planning, and environmental justice, and also an expert on the health impacts of urban nature with a focus on health equity. And currently, she's a senior researcher at the UOC, it's the Open University of Catalonia, where she co-leads the Planetary Health Research Group. And she's also an associated researcher at the IS Global, which is another research center in Barcelona, and also the Barcelona Lab for Urban Environmental Justice and Sustainability, where actually we still collaborate. We work together in, for example, in a big project on green gentrification, as some of you already know. She has also been recently awarded with a big project, Horizon Europe project, on the effective green care, how can be scaled up to improve adult mental health and well-being equity in Europe. So congratulations for this, Ita. And yeah, the floor is yours. So thank you. Do you want to use this?
Yes, thank you, Francesc, for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation. Thank you, Lena, for taking care of all the travel and accommodation, being super helpful. Thank you all for being here, even if it is the end of semester. The weather is nice, so everybody wants to be somewhere else and not here. Okay, I hope that you're going to enjoy hearing my thoughts, ideas, and research about how we can move from the right to the unhealthy and green deprived city and getting closer or building, planning a city that is healthy, sustainable, and just for all. So I'm going to start going quite far, I guess. Everybody is aware that we are in the Anthropocene era. We can think about the Earth as having 9 different dimensions. The Earth having a stratospheric ozone, atmospheric aerosols, ocean, biogeochemical flows, the nitrogen and phosphorus flows, freshwater, land systems, biosphere integrity, climate, we all hear about climate, and the novel entities. And so far, it has been assessed that from 2 of these dimensions, the biosphere and the biogeochemical flows, we have already trespassed the safe space, and in fact, we have entered a dimension or a stage of being at high risk of our own survival. These dimensions have been so much altered that we are risking being able to keep surviving in Earth. And then there are 2 other dimensions that I think it's quite funny, because one of them are the yellow ones. One of them is the climate change, the other one, the land system, that we have trespassed. We have gone further away from being in the safe space, and we are approaching being, again, in the risk area for our own survival. I think I find it funny that we keep hearing about climate change, but in fact, there are other dimensions in the Earth system that we have altered much more. So it is in this context of being in the Anthropocene that cities have been, in the last years, decades, branding themselves and trying to be healthy cities or sustainable cities. And what we quickly find, if we Google healthy, sustainable cities, we find web pages as the Global Observatory of Healthy and Sustainable Cities, where they have indicators from different cities in the world. For example, from Belgium, they have indicators about the city of Ghent. And they are looking at things like what is the percentage of population that has access to fresh food? In this case, nearly 50% of the population. What is the percentage of population that is living in a neighborhood that is highly walkable? In this case, compared with the other cities they have indicators of. And then they have indicators of what is the percentage of people living in neighborhoods with access to public green space. In this case, a very high percentage in Ghent, nearly 93% of the people living in neighborhoods with access to public green space. So it's in this direction of thinking about healthy, sustainable cities and green spaces that cities have started calling themselves or trying to brand themselves as healthy green cities. And also because when we think about green spaces, it's quite easy to think that green spaces can be a solution for some of the Anthropocene challenges that we are facing. Green spaces can help us reduce the air pollution, can help us decrease the high temperatures, with thermal regulation. They can help us with stormwater regulation. Then they can also be a place of biodiversity, of increasing biodiversity, conserving biodiversity. And this concept of healthy green cities, I would say, is very intuitive. I think when I talk to my grandmom about exploring or doing research on green spaces and health, she can very, clearly understand what I do or get an idea about what I do. We have been having scientific evidence about the links between green spaces and health since the 80s, I would say, and the research about these links has been growing. And in the last, I would say, 10 years, the research linking green spaces and health has really increased exponentially, especially the links between living close to green spaces and being healthier. So far, there are some reviews looking at all the evidence that has been produced and saying that we have enough evidence to say that living closer to green spaces is linked with a lower probability, lower risk of dying early, of having cardiovascular diseases, of having extreme blood pressure, blood glucose, or extreme body mass index. Also, living closer to green spaces is linked. There is enough evidence to say that it's linked to lower odds, lower probability, lower risk of mental disorders, low birth weight, physical inactivity, and sleep disorders. And in fact, it's based to all this epidemiological evidence that has been produced in the last years, that there has been some studies, some health impact assessment studies that I find are the more useful ones to convince policymakers, because you give them a very clear number that they can understand and make something with it. So based in all this epidemiological evidence, there are some studies like this one from Eloise Pereira Barbosa showing that if in 1,030 cities, European cities, we managed to have all the neighborhoods with at least 25% of their coverage being green spaces, we would be saving nearly 43,000 deaths every year in Europe. So very clear idea about the impact that increasing green spaces can have for our health and for our European population. It's also true that this relationship between green spaces and health, we have seen it also in the periods of emergency. So during the COVID pandemic, I guess that all of you experienced this need of being in nature or suddenly rediscovering, at least it was my case, rediscovering that I had plants at home and that I was enjoying really much taking care of these plants because I didn't have the opportunity to visit green spaces. In this review that Lavip et al. Did, looking at all the papers, all the scientific papers that had been done in the first 2 years of the pandemic looking at nature and health, what they saw is what we typically see in studies about green spaces and health, that a lot of health outcomes have been looked at. In this case, they found papers on depression, stress, anxiety, loneliness, psychological well-being, positive emotions, then different indicators of the COVID disease, and then general physical health, sleep disturbance, life satisfaction, and happiness. And they also realized that different articles have assessed exposure to nature or to green spaces in different ways. No? So they saw some papers looking at nature availability, nature access, viewing nature, then having real contact, the frequency, the duration of visits to nature, having contact with gardens, and then the indoor plants or the virtual nature. And what they found is basically that in those 2 first years of the pandemic, there is consistent evidence showing that those that were viewing nature, were visiting nature, or were visiting gardens had lower levels of depression, stress, anxiety, and better levels of psychological well-being. So we see how these green spaces are really good for our health also during the pandemic. However, the evidence also shows that the story about green spaces and health is not so straightforward. There is different scholars showing that when there is the same access to green spaces in different neighborhoods, the quality, the programming, and the real access to these green spaces is lower in those neighborhoods that are more underprivileged, so where low-income, ethnic, racial minorities live. And in fact, there is also evidence showing that that green spaces can be intimidating and even be perceived as unsafe for certain minority groups. And that they can also be related with experiences of discrimination, violence, or lynching. So bringing this nuanced understanding or reality about green spaces and people perceptions. So somehow this creates what we can call a green divide. We have in cities some high quality green spaces, like the one that you see in the left, where people will be more protected more protected to some of the Anthropocene impacts. And then we have some other green spaces that are in places where there are industries that are polluting, or there are motorways, or there are railways that make the access to these spaces really difficult. So the capacity to face the Anthropocene challenges will be much lower in these neighborhoods. And this somehow creates and reinforces some social injustices and some environmental privilege for others. So we see how we reproduce historical environmental injustices, where we have certain population groups that live in areas where there are high quality green spaces, and these groups of population are usually high income, majority ethnic racial groups. And then in the other side of the coin, or in the other part of the city, we have the low quality green spaces in areas where usually underprivileged, low income, racial ethnic minorities live. And this green divide has been more and more seen and understood and conceptualized, I think, in the last years with the proliferation of environmental gentrification, or green climate gentrification. And what do we mean with that is the improvement or creation of new environmental amenities, such as parks, that go together with certain political, economic agendas. And this combination between these new or improved amenities and these economic and political agendas end up meaning or resulting in the sociocultural and physical exclusion of underprivileged residents. For me, it's important to strengthen that more and more I understand or conceptualize gentrification not as only the physical exclusion, like evicting people from a neighborhood, but also this process that starts when your neighborhood is changing and you are still able to live in that neighborhood, but you don't have shops that sell products that you can buy because the prices suddenly start going up, or the products are starting products that you are not interested on. The social environment also changes in your neighborhood, so you start feeling that you are not part of that neighborhood anymore. So this creates this green paradox. No? We are hearing some scholars, a body of literature talking about green spaces being healthy, being good, being sustainable, being great to face the Anthropocene challenges. And in the other side, we are seeing scholars and literature showing us that green spaces are promoting displacement, are creating new exclusion and discrimination. But how have we reached to this paradox, no? Having these two discourses that do not go together? I would say that to understand that understanding the green spaces as a solution to the Anthropocene have resulted in large cities engaging in a kind of green global mission to keep doing interventions to get more green space in their cities. And this has gone together with this process of branding themselves as green, as sustainable, as healthy, and applying to awards to really be able to brand and show themselves and promote themselves as this the most green city in Europe, or the greener, more healthier city in Europe. But again, it's very clear in some cities that not always green is good, and we sometimes create this kind of green illusion that is very exemplified with the case of the Bosco Verticale in Milan, where we have skyscrapers with a lot of plants, several trees, but then studies guessing or assessing how sustainable building these skyscrapers have been, show that they have not been, or building them has not been sustainable at all. And also when we see some of the prices that these apartments have been sold for 7 million euros for an apartment, it's clearly not a price that the working class Italian person that lives in Milan can pay for one of these apartments. But then the question appears to understand how this green value has been created. Why real estate developers have been embracing and wanting to get more involved in green building construction and broader strategies and actions related to urban greening. And I think this is what our colleague Melissa Garcia-Lamarca has been working a lot on, understanding that these investors, bankers, real estate developers, and agencies have found a green potential and advantage in these green projects. They have found what she calls a green gap in these projects. And also, interestingly, somehow these real estate developers have managed to create value for themselves and to create money, basically capturing for themselves the social and the health benefits of green. That is what she calls this green grabbing, picking these health and social benefits. But what do we know so far about environmental, green, or climate gentrification? I would say that most of the evidence we have had so far has been qualitative and very based in studies focusing on one site. But in the last 5 years, more or less, there has been a real increase in large-scale quantitative studies. One example that I love to show is this study from Galia Shokri, looking at the different census tracts in Philadelphia. You have two different maps. In each map, the circles represent the percentage of the area that was transformed into green resilient infrastructure between 2000 and 2016. And then in the left side map, you have the representation of what happened with the Black population in each of the census tracts. And in the right side map, you have the representation of what happened with the Hispanic population. So in both cases, red indicates that the Black population or the Hispanic population increased. In the left side map, blue indicates that Black population decreased. In the right side map, the green is the color that represents a decrease in the Hispanic population. And I think it's very clear and very obvious to see that where more green resilient infrastructure was built between 2000 and 2016, it's where more Black population and a higher percentage of Hispanic population left. And on the other side of the coin, we have that Hispanic population and Black population increased where green resilient infrastructure was not built. So we are seeing, again, this, I guess, unexpected or unwanted effect, no? Where we have the population that will be less adapted, less prepared to face climate change, is where we are not building green resilient infrastructure to face and to help them adapt and mitigate the effects of climate change. I think it's important to bring some of the challenges, nuances on the research about green environmental gentrification, because the story, I think it's not as easy and as straightforward as this map sometimes seems to show. If we go to other studies like this one that Isabel Angelovsky led in half of the districts in Barcelona, she was looking at what had happened with parks that had been built after the Olympic Games between 1992, I think, and 2004, and the demographics and real estate prices around each of these parks. And what she found was basically that those parks in this district, San Martí district, that is facing the sea, around all these parks, there was changes in the demographic and real estate prices that could be associated or what we would envision as a symbol of gentrification. But then she was seeing that, or they were seeing that in a lot of other parks, this was not the case. All the ones that you see in white, the changes in the demographic and real estate prices are not indicating that gentrification was happening. So here it seems to illustrate very clearly that it's not only having green spaces that are going to make an area or a neighborhood to gentrify. Is probably the fact that here in San Martí, it was the industrial area with the Olympic Games. A lot of development happened. The buildings here were very easy for developers to transform into housing, high quality housing, if they wanted. Also, the changes in this neighborhood were very, very promoted, were a lot in the media, and were ongoing for a long time. In fact, we still have work going on and changes going on in this neighborhood. And on the other side, in this part of the city, there were also city-level developments happening, but this area is an area that was mainly built during the Franco dictatorship, so the housing is quite low-quality housing, so probably not very attractive for developers. Also, this area is not very well connected with the city center where the cultural services are located, and a lot of immigrant population lives in that area. So probably it's an area that is more challenging, less attractive for real estate developers to invest and to end up gentrifying. This story that we see here when just looking at one specific city is similar in a way to what we have seen when looking at different cities in Europe and North America. Here you have a list of the cities that we explored and the different associations that we look at when looking at different time periods for the green space building and also the gentrification. So for some of the cities, we did not find any clear associations between the creation or the improvement of green spaces and gentrification. But for most of the cities that we explored, that are the ones that you have in the left, we saw these associations. In the ones that you see in the top part, we saw, in fact, a long sustained relationship between greening and gentrification. With that, I mean that when looking at different time periods, we saw that there was this association between green spaces and greening. In the case of the ones that are at the bottom part, we also saw these associations, these links between greening and gentrification, but it was more specific only for certain time points, not for all the time points that we were looking at. And apart from these differences, when we look at all the cities that we found associations with, we also see that the role of greening is not always the same. In some cities, we see that greening has the stronger association with, greening has a stronger association with gentrification. So it's kind of the leading factor to determine if a neighborhood will gentrify or not. In some other cities, we see that greening is integrated, so it has the same role, the same strength of association than other factors. And in 3 cities, we saw that, in fact, greening was a subsidiary factor. In this case, I think it was usually the closeness to the city center that was the factor that had the stronger role. And also, it's important to think that not all green spaces will have the same role when we think about green spaces and gentrification. So looking at the same cities, looking at the associations between parks and gentrification, gardens and gentrification, nature preserves and gentrification, recreational spaces, and greenways, what we found in general was that parks seem to be the factor that in most cases, in more than half of our models, was associated with gentrification. So it seems to indicate that really real estate developers, agencies can very easily use parks to brand their developments, to say, if you come here, you will have access to this amazing park, see the photos, look at them, they're amazing. But with the other spaces, this seems to not be happening. Another point that is interesting is to go a bit a smaller scale and to explore what happens with the use of these green spaces. This is a study that Carmen Pérez del Pulgar led. I think it's very illustrative. She was looking at the use that children was making of 2 different parks. One in a neighborhood that is working class, non-gentrifying, and another park in a neighborhood that is gentrifying. This park is, you can see in the photos, has an urban feeling. It has infrastructure for very structured play, and you have to believe me if I say that it's located in a working class neighborhood, and it was built to kind of compensate the neighborhood for their lack of amenities. So it was really designed thinking the people that live here need a park, we want to give them a space that they can use. The other one, the one in the gentrifying neighborhood, I guess you can already see in the photos, that has a very different feeling. So it was built with this wild-alike aesthetic, thinking that these were the spaces that children were going to use for play, so very unstructured type of play. And it was built as part of the 22 plan to attract IT businesses in this area. So what Carmen did was to go different days to each of these parks and to look at what were children doing and how children were interacting with adults or not. So you have two graphs representing what was happening in each of these parks. In the left side graph, you have what was happening in the non-gentrifying, the working class neighborhood. And you see a lot of dots that are orange. Basically, those represent interactions between children, child and child interactions. And you see also a lot of lines that indicates that the child was moving from one group of people to another group of people. And you see some circles that are blue that indicate adult-adult interaction, but not so many. And then I think that when you put the other graph next to this one, it's very clear that it's very different. No? In this graph, we see very few orange circles, and it's mainly a lot of blue circles that I said are adult-adult interactions, and also quite a lot of black circles that indicate an interaction between a child and an adult. So we can really see what she was describing that she observed. In the working class neighborhood, children being more free to play, to experiment with the space. And in fact, she was explaining that these children were not using only the dedicated space to them. They were using creatively all the park. But in the gentrifying neighborhood, what she saw was that children were playing in a very directed way. Always there was, or nearly always, there was an adult with them, helping them develop the play. Children were not interacting with other groups in the park. It was more structured in a way. And also what I thought that was very interesting is that she describes that in the working class neighborhood, after being several days making observations, she was already able to identify children that she had seen previously. Not like, oh, this child, I saw him or her 2 days ago. But in the gentrifying area park, she did not manage to be able to identify any child. So it seemed that every day she was going, she was seeing new children. And she also describes how in the working class neighborhood, children were spending a big part of the afternoon just playing in the park, and how in the gentrifying neighborhood, it felt like children were with their parents or with their caretakers, just passing by, going from a school to home or from their grandparents' home to their homes, just spending half an hour in the park, 40 minutes in the park, but that was it. It was not a space to spend the afternoon in. And why I'm talking about gentrification and green gentrification suddenly if I started talking about health? Well, because all of them are related. And the story and all the literature that has been traditionally been done about green spaces and health and how great green spaces are for our health gets a bit more complicated if we take into account that cities are complex systems. We have different things happening at the same time. So we can have green spaces, but at the same time we can have gentrification happening in a neighborhood, right? So in this paper that Helen Cole did with data from New York City, she had data from nearly 44,000 people. She knew where these people were living in terms of what census tract they were living. You have the representation with the blue dots. And she could also assess the green space coverage of each of these census tracts. And she was also able to develop an indicator of gentrification. And you have the neighborhoods that were gentrifying marked with a bold, dark line. So what she saw is that when she was looking at just green spaces and health, the expected association, those living in greener areas or in census tracts that were greener had better self-perceived general health, had a lower odds, lower probability of reporting bad or poor self-perceived general health. But when looking at the different stages of gentrification or looking at if the neighborhood was gentrifying or not gentrifying, she saw that this relationship between green spaces and health was only present in the neighborhoods that were gentrifying. And I think that what is really cool about what Helen did is that she went one step further, and she looked at these neighborhoods that were gentrifying, what was happening by different social groups. So she looked at different race, ethnicity groups. She looked at if the people were highly educated or medium-low educated, and the income level. And unexpectedly, I would say, she saw that there were no differences by race, but with education and income, she saw that only those that were highly educated and had high income, so only those that were privileged, were benefiting, or their health was benefiting from health. So here, for us, the question was, what is happening with underprivileged neighborhood residents in these neighborhoods where there is green space and that are gentrifying, no? Why their health is not improving. So we did a study with 5 neighborhoods in Europe and North America. The Liberties in Dublin, North Glasgow in Glasgow, St. Henry in Montreal, Bayway Hunters Point in San Francisco, and Southeastern Anacostia in Washington, D.C. All these neighborhoods were neighborhoods that traditionally had underprivileged residents living, so ethnic, racial minorities, working class people. And all of them also, when we did the study, had interventions to improve or to create new green blue spaces. In most of the places was green, but in the case of Glasgow and Montreal, it was improving the access to a blue space, to a canal, to a river. So we went and we asked the underprivileged neighborhood residents, community groups, what was the perception of these new green spaces or these improvements to the access to blue spaces? What was the perception that underprivileged neighborhood residents had? And we got things like people saying, yes, for sure, green spaces, blue spaces have a role, have a potential to be therapeutic. Never know how to pronounce this word, therapeutic for me. But in fact, they are inaccessible. And you have a photo of Dublin. After the fence, there is a park. But really, this park can only be accessed by people that live in this building. People in the neighborhood cannot access this park. They also talk about green spaces that they had access to being still poor quality and maintained. And then for somebody coming from Europe, I was not expecting, but in North America, in the US, people were saying, great, I have a park, but in fact, I don't have money to pay for my medication, for my chronic health disease. So the fact that I have a park next to home is not going to really make a difference for my health or really have an impact in my health. They also talk about the persistent exposure to contamination versus an active marketing of these spaces. And with this, I mean that they were explaining us this green space that they are building, it's built in a Superfund place, so it's in a soil that is highly contaminated. They have decontaminated the first part of the soil, but not really gone in depth to clean this soil enough. So in fact, our health department tell us that it's not safe for our children or for our dogs to go and play with the soil of that green space. So that clearly means that for us, that we are living here and we are going to this green space every day, we cannot use it as we would like to do. And the other side of the same story, there is the part of saying, well, they are just cleaning it enough to be able to sell this neighborhood, to say that they have this amazing green space. So, as they said, so that millionaires who want to buy a vacation home and only be here for a month buy housing. But it's not really for those that are living all year long here. No, so this commodification of green spaces, use them just as selling points and just something that looks brilliant and glossy in the leaflets. Then they also talk about how these spaces were unwelcoming spaces for them and how they were not attracted to these spaces. They talk about things like we have a lot more police in the neighborhood than we used to have and kind of do patrols of the park, so it's harder to have a healthy mix of people in the places. They also talk about antisocial behavior and how they felt that newcomers were using the neighborhood and using public spaces in a way that they did not feel was respectful for the community and for the neighborhood. So saying things like, that sort of antisocial behavior I see in Oscar Square, Weaver Park, when they are drinking and I go straight up to them and say, not in my area. And then this last quote to represent the lack of attractiveness. No? This person in Washington, D.C. is saying, I was just at Anacostia Park yesterday and noticed that they have big piles of wood and trash that they had pulled out the river. It's ugly to me. They're like prepping this area for people that are not us. And this brings us to the last aspect, no? And the privilege people really explaining us how they were really aware that the improvements that were happening in their neighborhood was not for them. They were talking about how they used to go to the parks with their friends, with their family, but now their friends, their family had been evicted. They were not able to pay for the rent anymore or for the property taxes anymore. So because their family, their friends were not there, they were also not going to the park because they used to go with their friends or their family. And quotes, I think, very clearly illustrating what was happening, like when they are done with the park, most of us probably won't be here to enjoy it. So what we saw was basically that this theoretical concept of green spaces, blue spaces being therapeutic landscapes because they have environmental, material, physical dimensions, they have social dimensions, they have certain spiritual, cultural, symbolic dimensions, and they have relational dimensions that make them healthy and therapeutic. We see that in fact, all of these dimensions were altered or are altered when we have greening and gentrification happening at the same time. So, as I've been saying, we have the environmental, material, physical dimensions altered with things like low, unpleasant, or privatization of the access to these spaces. We have the social dimension altered with things like the antisocial behavior, or things like family and friends being kicked out from the area so they cannot use green spaces with them anymore. We have the spiritual, symbolic, cultural dimensions altered because we have them feeling there is too much police, they are controlling me, I don't feel welcome in this space. And we have the relational dimensions aspect with things like having to pay for your chronic medication, and really in front of that problem, having green space is not really going to make such a difference. So what we have seen is basically that green spaces for underprivileged neighborhood residents become what we can call disruptive green landscapes or green Lulus. So underprivileged residents do not benefit from them, and they even end up not wanting them in their area. Because what we see is that underprivileged neighborhood residents are left with this right only to the unhealthy and green deprived city. And how can we move from this unhealthy and green deprived city to making or designing, planning, thinking healthy, sustainable, green, and just cities? Well, one of the things that we have, or we did in the lab was looking at different cities in Europe and North America, and looking at anti-displacement tools and greening tools and how they can go hand by hand. So we identified 30 different anti-displacement tools like rent control, taxes on vacant housing units, controlling moratorium on businesses, hotels, etc. And we also look at what are the green promoting policies or planning tools that town councils can have. And we identified 20 different tools, like a fee that the developer could pay for directly developing greening, or making sure that each development project would have a minimum percentage of green spaces. So the idea is that each city, depending on their own context, should combine or could combine this anti-displacement and these greening policies or planning tools to improve or to work towards healthy, greener, just cities. Another thing we have been doing, and I think it's important, is better conceptualizing what do we mean with just, what do we mean with environmental justice, and what are the different dimensions that this encompasses. I think most of us think about the dimension of the distributive justice. So are all neighborhoods having the same access, the same coverage of green spaces? Is everybody benefiting the same from green spaces? But there are a lot of other dimensions, no? Like in the participatory processes, do we really have a bottom-up or a top-down approach? Are we giving voice to everybody? Are we giving the tools, the space, so everybody feels safe to share their experiences? Are we giving room, and are we recognizing that there will be conflicting experiences shared, but we have to embrace them and we have to move forward with them? In this direction also, I think more down-to-earth things, like are we making these participatory processes at different times during the day to ensure that different people will be able to come and to participate? Are we having somebody to take care of kids, so those that have caring duties can come also to participate without worrying about their kids? Are we giving the same credibility to everybody, or there are certain voices that we are hearing more or we are paying more attention to? And also, I think in the European context, this reparative justice aspect, I think, or I feel in the US, they know that they have, or they have assumed, they recognize that they have a very segregated society, and there is a lot of injustices, historical injustices that they have to repair. But I feel in the European context, we are struggling a little bit more thinking about it. So I think it's important to think about it and to start applying it. Another thing we have been doing to try to work towards a healthier, greener, sustainable, and just cities is in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, realizing how it was more evident than ever the health inequities, the health injustices that were happening, how it was also more evident that there are certain caring tasks that certain population groups are doing much more than others, and how it was also a moment, I think, for a lot of us to realize that our health is related with the health of the other, the one next to me, but it's also related with the health of animals, and it's in fact related with the health of the earth system, no? Because all the exploitation activities that we have been doing means that we are more in contact with animals, and for that reason there is more potential for pandemics to happen. So thinking how we can move from this idea of the healthy cities and bringing ideas from environmental justice, caring cities, intersectionality, and ecofeminism to build and to conceptualize what we call just ecofeminist healthy cities. In this sense, what we did is basically reflect on what we could do from research with things like ensuring that you have a space in your team meetings to check how is each member doing, ensure that you're going to compensate all the participants properly, ensure that your research outputs will be open access, that you will not only do scientific papers, no, that you will produce documentaries, that you will produce infographies that communities then will be able to use. So your research will really have an impact. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about is how, after reflecting and working in all this and thinking how we can work towards healthy, sustainable, just cities, with this new Horizon Europe project that we will start in September, kind of opens the room and I think an opportunity to include or to start thinking how we can really make a small step with the project towards these healthy, sustainable green cities. So the project Green Me, as Frances said, looks at how can we improve exposure to nature with the idea to improve mental health and well-being equity in Europe. And we're going to do it focusing or conceptualizing that exposure to nature basically is in 3 dimensions. We have the nature-based therapy. We have health promotion that can happen in nature, no? Like you go to do Tai Chi in a green space, in a park, instead of being in a gray area or in a room. And then we have nature in everyday life. That would be the urban parks, the gardens that we can experience every day when we go from home to work or from home to school. So what we want to do is to diagnose what is the stage of the integration between these 3 different dimensions in different cities, different regions of Europe, and also what is the integration of nature-based therapy with the healthcare system. Then we want to increase the scientific evidence about the links between green space, exposure with nature, and mental health equity. And finally, we want to empower green care actors that we define as those that are already in the field doing the real work, those that are already implementing nature-based therapy. We will do different things in some areas that we have identified as front-runner countries. That would be those that have nature-based therapy more integrated or are closer to have it integrated in the healthcare system. And then in some areas that we have identified as follower countries that we believe are further from integrating nature-based therapy in the healthcare system. The different countries that we will use for the exploration are Sweden, the UK, Spain, Italy, Poland, Germany, and then the US. So I just want to finish, and I hope it was more or less clear that there is a lot to do to make healthy, sustainable, green, and just cities. That is the only way to face the Anthropocene challenges, leaving no one behind. And that I hope that in the next few years, we will be one step further, and the same conversation will have a very different scope and outcome. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much, Margarita. I think it was super interesting with a lot of concepts at the same time, but making the link throughout all of them. Okay, and now it's the time that I give the voice to you, and you can ask super insightful questions to the speaker, to Margarita. Yeah, but also silly questions are also okay. Okay, yeah. We have first one there.
Hello. Thank you for the presentation. It was really nice. I was wondering, in those underprivileged neighborhoods, did you see uses of existing green space, and do you also see like possibilities to enhance that use or yeah, to enhance it without like having this whole gentrification aspect to it?
Great question. I think it's a bit difficult to give just one answer. I think for sure there is potential in those underprivileged neighborhoods for parks to be still a space that the community and that them will use. And I think with quotes like the one for with the police, for example, it's very clear, no? Like if you were not having police there, probably underprivileged neighborhood residents would be using the space as they used to have. And it's just the fact that there is police that makes them feel they cannot be in that space. So for me, there is like this situation where the space has not changed so much, and it's more like the social atmosphere that has changed and makes them feel not welcome. And then you have the other situation where maybe the aesthetics of the park has changed so much that they do not feel attracted to it. And probably that situation is a bit more tricky to change, no? Because you have design, you have spent money designing a new park, super cool park, but then long-term residents do not feel engaged to use it. So, well, you have to start a participatory process to change the park again and spend more money to change it. And I think the second part of your question, the gentrification part, for me, maybe comes down. I would relate it with what I was presenting about the anti-displacement tools. No? If you ensure that, well, you are improving green spaces, but you have a tool that ensures rents will not increase, property taxes will not increase for those that are already living in that neighborhood, then people, the community, will be able to stay. So probably the usual uses of the traditional uses of those parks will be more easily maintained. Did I answer to your question? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I have a question about the relation between gentrification and segregation, because you presented many examples and Europe and North America, but every time you gave, let's say, you went in depth, you moved to the North American examples. And I'm not saying that there's no segregation in the European setting, but it's quite a different kind than, let's say, the North American setting, which has an established history of strong spatial segregation, whereas in the European context, often it happens on a much more micro level. It's more mixed use, and if segregation happens, it's often segregation within place and then hence more social, which leads to a different causality, I think, or a different question, because what then happens if you green a space in a setting which is already quite diverse spatially speaking when it comes to, let's say, the mix of population? And I sort of got lost a bit in the explanation there, what does that mean? Because you also gave the example of Barcelona as a kind of counterexample. Is this then, let's say, can this be generalized in a sense? Because it could also suggest that because gentrification might not happen because actually we're starting from a different starting point than in the US examples you gave.
Okay, I'm not completely sure I understood all your rationale, but I'm going to try to answer or explain my thoughts, and then you can maybe. I think it seems from what I've been seeing and hearing that maybe it's not, let's say, it's like in a U-shaped relationship, like areas that are super segregated, where you clearly only have underprivileged population living, are very difficult to be gentrified. And that would be the example of certain areas in the US, because there is that history of segregation, but I think we can also think about Barcelona and Raval, for example, that is an area that is in the city center and has not gentrified. So I think for me that's a part of the story. And in fact, also when you talk with people, sometimes they say, or what I heard in the interviews was like, I wanted to move here because it's a mixed social mixed neighborhood. So that's something that is attractive. But I did not hear anybody I wanted to move here because it's a black neighborhood. That's not something I heard about. And I think in the US context, also this historical segregation means that in terms of the environmental amenities, it's very, and the housing quality, it's an historic thing, has been happening for such a long time. I think that in Europe we have segregation, but maybe it's not something so clearly with certain population group always been segregated because we had redlining determining that blacks were going to be living here and whites were going to be living here. Did I answer your question? I don't know.
Yeah, yes, partially. I'm not sure if my question was formulated clearly either, but it might also create a different, let's say, perspective or perception of inhabitants in a certain place, because you establish a kind of dichotomy in the presentation between we have a place and we gentrify this place through greening, basically, and then the population that was already there just doesn't feel at ease anymore, doesn't feel at home anymore.
Yes.
But in a situation which is already, let's say, more mixed population was from the beginning, actually the kind of perceptions towards green space between, let's say, privileged and underserved communities might be quite similar, would be one hypothesis.
Interesting hypothesis, but it's not what I have seen, I think, in the field. I think in mixed neighborhoods, what comes to mind when I think about it, I'm going to explain it, is Cleveland, Detroit, Showway neighborhood, very mixed neighborhood, historically working class, a lot of industries. They are very close to a lake. They have built a big green space with views to the city center, and suddenly they have luxury housing being built. The restaurants are increasing the prices as crazy. People cannot pay for their property taxes, so even those that own a house have to leave the neighborhood. So yeah, great, we have the green space, but we don't like it anymore. They are doing activities there. That is a music festival every Friday during the summer. There are food trucks. We cannot pay for the food prices in those food trucks, so it's clearly not a space for us anymore. So.
Yeah, it could be, but again, US examples.
Yeah.
Okay, more questions. Yes, I'm happy that some of my students are also asking.
Thank you very much for the very intriguing presentation. Since it has not been the first of this kind this year, in the last year, I would like to ask you a different question. And here I apologize already, because from my professional background, I'm much more exposed also to ecology and engineering aspects. And I do kind of wonder, if we start with a planetary boundary concept and we see that we have a problem on biodiversity loss, to my understanding, I think the numbers of humans multiply, whereas we're losing non-human species. So moving from there into environmental justice and then gentrification kind of blanks out a lot of other issues. And how do you assess the chances that environmental justice and ecological justice could maybe be better combined? Because in the end, humans have tried a lot in order to kick out nature as much as possible. Now we have an eruption there. We have a lot of knowledge gaps when it comes to biodiversity, which is super scaring to me. But if we integrate nature, we integrate a lot of species into our life, and people may not like it. So what will happen then? So would this be a huge issue, considering how much the concept of environmental justice and gentrification has developed now, to open doors, to take a step back and to try to be more comprehensive again, if we talk about planetary boundaries and healthy and sustainable cities? Thank you.
Okay, so you're asking me what happens with the biodiversity and increasing, I guess, green spaces when we think about environmental justice and inequities in terms of potentially increasing our contact with biodiversity and our perceptions about that biodiversity, like.
I think it's more a question of conceptualizing environmental and ecological justice as one concept for sustainable and healthy cities, so that we can plan better for the future. Because right now, I see the social dimension, I completely understand it, but I also know what the issues are on the more ecological and the engineering side, and I see that there is a little bit of a disharmony. So, but at the end, if more greenery is included, this will also lead to more species, more allergenicity, more animals that may not be appreciated. So this is an important factor for me as well when we talk about environmental justice.
Okay, I think for me, the link that you make with more green, meaning more animals, more species, sometimes I'm not completely sure or buying it completely. I think there are also a lot of ways to increase greening in a city. That does not mean you're going to have more species in the city, if that makes sense. At least, yeah, I think in some contexts, we are used to having green spaces that are only grass, but that does not mean that we're bringing a lot of different species. So that point, maybe I do not say it. But it's true that what I said is that they have the potential to work with the conservation of biodiversity or increasing biodiversity. And yeah, I completely agree that is challenging in some specific contexts more than in others. And I think probably there is a lot of work to do in understanding or in changing a bit the perceptions of people about the interactions with animals. I don't know the Belgium context, but a lot of examples about tricky experiences in Catalonia come to mind, like people not wanting wild pigs, people not wanting suddenly rabbits, people not wanting, I don't know, it seems each animal we end up finding, now we are not happy with it. And the only solution that we are giving, at least in the Catalan context, is that we need more hunters. But it seems that it's very hard to understand or to talk about, we have this issue, we have a lot of rabbits because we don't have the species that would eat the rabbits, we have destroyed the trophic chain. Do you say it like that in English? So I think for me, if I think in the context I know, I feel there is a lot of work to do in terms of changing perceptions and changing the way that we see nature, but I know then that there are more challenging contexts. Now, I've read some articles about India and how they suddenly have a tiger in their village, and well, because they are in the middle of a natural area, and obviously that's really challenging. And I think there, in some cases, is a lot of environmental specialist work to do to try to balance what the humans need versus what nature needs, and how can you better protect maybe the village in another way. I think I did not answer completely your question, but yeah, I think it's challenging, and I think there is a lot of work in terms of perception to change in our context or in the context that I know more.
Did he answer or she answer or not? I think the question is a bit to what extent, like increasing environmental justice in cities, it's also an opportunity for ecological justice in the sense that cities can be also places for not only humans but also for other species, and to what extent there is a relationship between that or not, or you see more challenges in that sense than opportunities. Maybe it's a bit what you wanted to ask or not.
Biodiversity. So it's kind of scary when you look into biodiversity research, what we know, what we don't know.
Yes.
And talking about the top of the ladder and not at the bottom, which is a fundament. It's just wondering what will happen in 30 years, 40 years when certain green spaces have been implemented and then people start not liking it anymore as before.
Yeah. So it's a bit about these services, I think, here. A bit about if rewilding of cities is a good idea or not, maybe, or not. Or it's a bit like this, or? Okay, yeah.
I think with some of the examples you were putting, like mosquitoes or rats, no, for me, in my mind, is like, well, why do we have so many mosquitoes? Maybe, again, for me, it's like we don't have who is eating the mosquitoes, probably, or we have imported a species that were not here. So for me, putting the focus on the animal is like, I don't know, I don't like it. I don't feel comfortable with it because we have created the problem ourselves. And I think then, yeah, this part of rewilding the city, I think I don't have a clear answer to it. I think also for me, it's this spectrum of what is a green space and how wild or unwild. Unwild does not exist, no? But I mean, I guess you can have a diversity also in terms of how wild the green space is, depending on how close or not so close to the population is. I don't know, I feel there is people here with better ideas about this than me. I do not spend a lot of time thinking about wilding or not.
Yeah, maybe that's more a question for an ecologist. But yeah, maybe I go first there because I think you had the hand before, and then I go there.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I would like to follow up with the question from the gentleman as well, because I just noticed during your lecture that you were bringing up a lot of examples and research about Western Europe and North America. Yeah. And then I heard about the Green Me project that is funded by the European Commission, I guess. And it included, for example, countries like Poland, which are in Central or Eastern Europe. Yeah. So my question is, like during the project that you're working on, are you planning also on doing some research in this type of countries, like from Central and Eastern Europe, or the Balkan countries, that might have just different outcomes, or they can struggle with different problems? So is it your plan? Is it part of the project, or not? Or are you just going to implement the things that you've learned from the research on other countries from other regions?
Super. Yeah, sorry, probably I did not explain myself very well, and I just ran through the last slides. Yes, Poland is one of the sites, and we're going to do research there. The Green Me project does not include anything on gentrification, but we're going to be talking with stakeholders, with healthcare professionals, with patients, with the administration to try to figure out why nature-based therapy is not integrated in their healthcare system, what are the challenges that they're facing, what are the interests or not in having it integrated. So yeah, for sure, we are not going to just make research in Spain or UK or whatever and just transfer that there. We're just going to really try to understand each of the contexts. And then what we want to do is see if in some countries they have identified some things, some legal opportunities, some administrative ways of working that have been successful, see if that can be inspiring and can be helpful for others to imagine how to implement it or how to improve their own situation.
Thank you.
And also just to add, in one of the previous projects on basically green spaces health without looking at equity, we also did a lot of work in in Poland. And we saw that basically the relationships between green space and health are also happening there, even if the reality of the cities is quite different. The general associations are also present there.
Okay, there was a question here, right? Yeah, no, but no, we can go here first. So I prioritize students, and then I go there.
Hi, thank you so much for the very interesting presentation. So you talked a lot about also including the inhabitants and residents and different stakeholders in in doing research and finding solutions and stuff. But this will also generate a very wide array of opinions and perspectives. And in our limited time frame that we have, do you think this can really solve and find acceptable solutions while avoiding green gentrification? Or will this just cost more energy and time than we will benefit? Because we're going to get so many different opinions and perspectives from it.
So the question is if participatory processes are worthwhile, like if they are worth it.
No,
is that the question?
If it's going to be possible, if it's going to be feasible in the time frame that we have, for example, because I feel like the next 10, 20 years are very crucial. And if we have to think long-term and think ahead of time and including so many different stakeholders and people and investing time and energy in reaching them all, is that even feasible? Will that...
Well, I think that some cities are doing it already, some communities are doing it already. And I think the question is also what kind of future do we want? Like, do we want to be prepared for the climate change, but only some of us and leaving some people unprepared? Or do we really want to try to move all of us forward? So I personally think it's worth it, and it's the only way to move forward. But if we only think in efficiency terms and in, I don't know, economy again or money, for sure we are going to assume that it's not worth it, I guess. So it depends on if we really want to change the way that we are doing things from my point of view.
Okay, there is another question here.
Okay, it's a question which is a bit related to the one before. So I wanted to ask if you know if there is a tendency of citizens to be more skeptical towards greening because they associate it with gentrification, because this is what I've observed in the participation process, and I found it a bit scary. Yeah, so if it exists, like if there's like kind of a scientific observation of that and what kind of solution there might be.
I don't know about any study looking at if the skepticism towards green spaces have increased, but I think I share your feeling about it seems that more and more we are talking about it. But I don't know if it is only about green spaces and gentrification, or it's more about changes in the city and what does that imply for long-term residents. No, I feel that more and more there can be a cultural equipment that will also increase the potential of the neighborhood to be gentrified. So then long-term residents are like, we don't want this here. So I think it's not only with green spaces. And we were talking before about this, like I feel in a lot of times residents are kind of put, or we are put in a very weird position, like we feel we have to choose between two things. Either you want a green space or you want a new primary healthcare center. And I think a lot of times this is also a very unfair place to put residents to. And sometimes it seems that we are not given, or we are not giving population all the information. We are not giving them all the potential possibilities, and we are just telling them you have to choose. Either is you have a green space, or either you can stay in your neighborhood. And we are not telling them, well, maybe you can have a green space and you can stay in the neighborhood if we implement this other thing, this policy. I don't know. Maybe somebody knows about some research done about the increase of skepticism about green spaces. I have. Okay.
No, I mean, it's not about green space per se, but for instance, in Brussels, all the resistance against sustainable mobility, so it's a bike lane gentrification. So it's not greening as in trees, but it's greening as in, I mean, it's broader than that. It's sustainable, the sustainable city like faces resistance because there is knowledge that when you put a bike lane, I mean, I'm exaggerating and I partially disagree with the statement where like you put a bike lane and the hipster will come in and will not be able to find my ethnic food anymore. I don't know what, but like, so there is actually, I don't know research about it, but I'm sure there is like observation about what happens because it's people have seen that happening and they want to trust in the new development.
And also about this recurrent eviction, no? Like you have been in a neighborhood, you have had to move because there was a new park being built, you are in a new neighborhood, and now they are changing that neighborhood, and you have to move again. Like this recurrent trauma or double, triple trauma that you end up experiencing.
You had a question, no? Yeah.
Thanks a lot for the presentation. We just had this degrowth conference here in Brussels, organized by the European institutions. Are there any connections to be made to that debate? Because it seems like the story about green gentrification is very much about distributing resources among people in relation to nature, but less about that overall relation to the planet, which probably, especially in terms of biodiversity, would mean a drastic shrinkage of our consumption of space, et cetera, So it could be potentially that the allocation problem that you're describing is only going to intensify. So I was just wondering, in terms of scholarship, are there connections being made to the degrowth debate?
Not expert about degrowth here, but for me, at the end, everything is related, and I know that there are some scholars on degrowth talking a lot about health and well-being. For me, there is a clear connection, no? And also with the injustice part, like if you only think about economic growth, and in economic terms, it's clearly that you're not going to give the value to health that it deserves, no? Like if you put a value to the life of a person, then like the conversation shifts a lot. I think if you're able to say this person is worth this amount, and if they die, I'm only losing this amount of money. So for me, it's very connected, but I would not be able to do a long explanation about the way they are connected.
I think an expert in degrowth would also say that in a kind of degrowth situation, the housing issue would, housing would not be something to be sold in the market like we do nowadays, and then probably all the gentrification issues that we are talking about wouldn't be such a problem. But I don't know, I'm not an expert in degrowth either. More questions. Amy, yes.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the presentation. I found it really interesting, and I found the examples you gave very impactful. And I think as well, this presentation of the work that the Green Lulus group has been doing is really important. And my question is sort of about the next step from that, which is, and maybe this is a bit beyond the scope, but how do we convince cities that this is something that they need to prioritize? And maybe are there good examples of cities that have taken on a very ambitious and aggressive anti-green gentrification, anti-displacement approach? And I don't know, and why they did that? Because, and maybe it ties in a bit to the, I don't know, this idea of a degrowth or a shift in mindset, but I'm just curious to know how we put this very strongly on the agenda, and if that has been done before?
I think it depends a lot on the government that you end up having. And the first example that comes is what I know, that is Barcelona. I think that we have been trying, or we have been lucky to have a government that is trying to have an increase in greening and at the same time trying to fight the crazy housing market that we have. They have been, I think, not as successful as we all wish, and I guess they even wished to be more successful than what they have been being, but at least it's something, and for sure we would be worse with another government. You started the question with another thing. I should have written it down.
I forgot to. No, just how to convince cities that this should be a priority on the agenda. I mean, it's a big question, but just curious to know if...
Yeah. I think for me, sadly, it relates a little bit with what we were talking about before and what I was showing at the beginning of the presentation. I think that when you show cities this is impacting health in this way, and this is causing you to spend this amount of money in your healthcare system, then is when they start listening to you. Sadly, but true.
Thanks.
Yes. More questions? Yeah, okay, I go first there. And
it's more of a comment than a question. Now we're having all these conversations about how to increase the green spaces, public spaces, but I feel like there's not enough conversation on how to encourage the individuals, the house owners, this like also individual consciousness of what the green space gives as a health benefit or opportunities, because like we were talking, you were giving an example of America and New York. I know examples of neighborhoods being very much anti-green space just because it's like the breeding space for all the delinquent behavior with drug dealers. And if you ask them, oh, do you recommend this park? They're like, no, the whites go to the Central Park. They don't hang out in the neighborhood parks. So you got to also start with promoting or the education on the side of the users, that they have to know that what the parks can be used for. Start compete with the drug dealers in a way to say like, hey, I'm here to enjoy the park. You're not here to use it as your business spot. And here in Brussels, you have all this typology of urban blocks that you have little gardens in the back, and some of them are greener than other. That also gives the shared benefit of having plants, having little trees, things like that. But yeah, I don't see that very much in Europe, at least. Probably not in America either. Being on the side of pushing for individuals to start appreciate, to start doing something small, start from bottom up encouragement, engagement, and stuff like that.
You talk about drug dealers in green spaces, and automatically I think about Barcelona city center, very close to touristic areas, and we have a specific square that is full of problems with drugs. I was sitting there with some colleagues 2 months ago. There was a gun fired in the middle of the square, so completely unexpected use of the plaza or the square. And what I heard from some people that lived there but moved away, and one of the reasons they moved is due to the insecurity and unsafety, is that it seems that all this drug dealing is related with tourism, because in Barcelona we have I think, drug-related tourism. And how people that live in the neighborhood would really like to reclaim that square, but they are too scared. Like what they can do as just 3 families, 5 families, when there is such a big problem. I think for me, I struggle a little bit with when do we put the responsibility to the community and when the problem is a bit bigger and the solutions should come from those that are a bit upper. I do not think that the families in the community, well, they can do something in front of the drug dealing, but I do not think that they can do much or that they can solve the problem in all the green spaces. Can I just jump back to the question that was made previously and I did not answer completely the question? If I understood, the issue was, I cannot stop thinking that I did not answer your question completely. Yeah. Okay. The relationship between green spaces and gentrification, or the relationship?
Well, and we start from somewhere, from a place, right? And that place, depending on if it's more mixed or less mixed to begin with, I would assume it has an impact. Maybe not. I mean, maybe you see the same process everywhere. There's also a bit, I think, more reflection on the literature on gentrification, because I think one of the key critiques towards gentrification literature has been that there's a US bias in that literature, and that you cannot apply it one-to-one to European settings.
Uh-huh. Okay, I think I agree with you that for sure the cities are differently, but I do not think that is only the urban structure. I think that there are other things happening that make the US context much different from Europe. No, I think that we have more protective policies than in the US. The fact that we have a healthcare system is also a clear difference. And the way that I look at it, to me, it seems that is a process, the gentrification or the green gentrification that has started in the US, and for that reason we see it more strongly there, and we see more examples and more diversity, but it's a process that is going all over the world. Yeah, just was during all the questions trying to find an example about Barcelona, about a mixed neighborhood. Yeah.
But you can think about it, and then you can discuss in private. Maybe even Bas will join the dinner, so you will have plenty of time. No, but yeah, there was a question here as well.
Yeah. I don't know if it's a question, and it's not very clear in my mind. Because here in Brussels, for example, a lot of trees disappear. So we can talk about greening spaces, which always will happen with a green architect, landscape architect who makes drawings that are not necessarily connected to the space they are implied in. Well, I don't know. Yes. But there are an enormous amount of trees that get cut, and I think in the poorer areas, as we say, it's even worse, because there people don't even react, and they don't always like trees, because if they have a car, they will make sure they will hit it. For example, or they will put their garbage on it. So, yeah, I don't know. We are losing a lot of green space. Also in those areas, because they don't fight to keep them. they don't see, I don't know if they see the use of it.
So the question is, what do we do with underprivileged residents not wanting or not valuing trees, green spaces?
Yeah, and then they live, because I live in Saint-Jos, and then you have politicians in charge who don't really care. Here in Brussels, we have politicians who just keep on, well, most of them keep cutting trees first. So, and then you have less resistance to that maybe in other areas. In richer areas may be more sensitive to, or may have more space in their lives to fight for it. I don't know.
Yeah, for sure. No, they like certain.
It's not an easy fight. It's I can tell you, it's day and night that those people work on it. So it's not as if they have all the luxury in the world to fight for a tree. But
You say that there is some people that do not have the luxuries, but that still fight for it. You say that those.
it's not because you're from it's not because you have a job and you have an income that you have all the time in the world to fight for to keep the green spaces.
Yeah.
Because the forces that cut them down are really enormous.
Yeah.
And in the public, how do you say it, in the authorities, they are not, in their mind, they do not think of preserving it. So if they want to do a bicycle lane, they will cut the trees, for example, or they will just, and yeah, there's not always people to fight to keep the green spaces.
Yeah, for me it has like different, I don't know, ideas come to mind, no? Like I think what we were saying before, no? Like how do you convince the town council or the administration that it's important to keep green spaces? And we were talking about that. And then what you were saying about underprivileged neighborhoods not being or not fighting so much against trees being cut. For me, what came to mind is in some examples that even underprivileged people is asking for trees to be cut down. So then, for me, it's like, why these people want those trees down? No, they don't want these trees. I think that we have to understand better why they don't want them, to try to figure out how we can have a better picture and present a better picture about, well, you have this problem, but in fact, all these things are beneficial and are related with having a tree as well. But yeah, I agree completely that this is very challenging, and it's very time-consuming and energy-consuming, some of these fights, yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know, there is more questions. Maybe people from working on Brussels environment want to say something about it. No, I'm joking. No, okay, I have a question, maybe still, I mean, we are supposed to finish in 2 minutes, I think, but I wanted to ask a question about the last part of your presentation about the green care issue, and I think it's a bit related to this idea of prescribing nature. I was wondering to what extent this is something that it has been implemented in Europe, in some European countries, to what extent there will be a day that you go to the doctor because you are very stressed, and they will prescribe you to, and the Social Security will pay you, I don't know, a trip to a natural area because, yeah, it's good for your health. If this is something maybe happening, I don't know, I know in Japan they maybe are at these stages, but not here. And to what extent you think that this prescribing of nature can be also a solution to the issues of green inequities in cities? So the fact that, okay, a doctor can say, okay, you don't have maybe a nice green space in your neighborhood, but I'm gonna pay you or we are gonna fund a week in a very nice natural area, or this is made science fiction, what I'm saying, or yeah, I don't know, what do you think is the next steps on that thing?
I don't know about what is happening in all countries in Europe. I know in the UK, for example, they said that, yes, they have this social prescribing that includes some nature-based therapy. So I think in UK you go and you can get a prescription. And then I think it's what I'm really looking forward to understand. Like I know that in Spain, or at least in Catalonia, the doctor has access to seeing where do you have a green space close to the GP place? So they could prescribe you that, but they are not doing it. So I'm really looking forward to understand why they have the tool, but they are not using it. It seems, or what I hear is that they want to do it, like talking with doctors, they want to, but they are too scared that they don't have the precise protocol about when a person comes with this disease of this strength, I can prescribe 3 days per week in this. So it seems we need to have a very detailed protocol for them to start using the tool that they already have. Sorry, I get a bit angry about that. So yeah, I'm looking forward to hear more and learning more about the UK example. They are one of the countries we're going to work with and see how we can get inspired by them. And then the other question, like how green or nature-based therapies can be a solution for those that do not have so much access to green space. That was the question. I think, and you know a bit what I'm going to say, because we have talked about forest bathing in Japan. I think that it should not be the solution. I think that it is more impactful what you can do at city level. So the energy, the time that we will have to spend to prescribe each person exposure to nature and ensure that they go and they get exposed, I think we would be much more efficient. We would have much more health benefits if we were improving greening in the city or access to nature in the city, I think. At population level, it would be better. I'm not saying at individual level, for sure it's better if you can go 15 days in the middle of an amazing landscape with no signs of humans, but I think at population level, it's better the other.
Yeah, but then you have the problem of gentrification.
Well, you have to implement anti-displacement tools.
Yeah, I was just kidding. Okay, I'm gonna, there's a camera here, sorry. Okay, any other last question maybe for Margarita? No? Okay, so then I would say thank you very much again for dealing with all these questions and the very interesting presentation. And
thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
You deserve a good dinner.